April 4th, 1945. A Sherman tank from the 4th Armored Division rolls through the German countryside near Gotha, its commander scanning the road ahead. Private First Class James Hoyt rides in the turret, exhausted after weeks of combat, watching farmland give way to forest. Then the wind shifts, and a smell hits him that will never leave his memory. Not smoke, not explosives, something else, something worse. Hoyt will later tell investigators, he thought. At first they were downwind from a chemical plant. Others in his unit compared it to burning feathers, to spoiled meat left in summer heat, to something their minds couldn't quite categorize because they'd never encountered it before. The column slows. Orders crackle over the radio. A camp ahead, possibly a prisoner of war facility. Approach with caution. What Private Hoyt and thousands of other American soldiers discovered that spring, in dozens of locations across Germany, was not what their training had prepared them for. Not what their commanders had briefed them about. Not what the sanitized intelligence reports had suggested they might find. They discovered evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale, and what they said, what they did, what they became in those moments of discovery reveals something profound about the collision between human expectation and inhuman reality. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The liberation of Nazi concentration camps was not a planned military objective. It was an accident of geography. As Allied forces pushed into Germany from both east and west in the final months of 1945, combat units advancing toward Berlin and other strategic targets kept stumbling across installations that didn't match any known category. They weren't military bases. They weren't factories. They weren't prisoner of war camps, at least, not as defined by the Geneva Conventions. American military intelligence in early 1945 possessed fragmentary information about the Nazi camp system. Reports from resistance networks, from escaped prisoners, from intercepted communications, all suggested that Germany operated labor camps, where conditions were harsh and prisoners were mistreated. But the full scope, the actual purpose, the bureaucratized machinery of genocide remained largely unknown to frontline American troops. The 4th Armored Division, advancing through Thuringia in early April, received no specific orders regarding concentration camps. Their mission was simple and direct. Keep moving east. Destroy enemy resistance. Secure territory. When scouts reported a large fenced installation near the town of Ohrdruf on April 4th, the initial assumption was that it might contain German troops or perhaps prisoners of war who would need processing. What they found instead defied description in the vocabulary, available to soldiers trained for conventional combat. The camp at Ohrdruf was a sub-camp of the larger Buchenwald system, designated S3 in German administrative files. It had been established in November 1944 to provide slave labor for construction projects, including tunneling work intended to create emergency headquarters facilities for Nazi leadership. By early April 1945, as American forces approached, the SS guards at Ohrdruf faced a problem. They had approximately 11,700 prisoners, most so weakened by starvation and disease that they couldn't march. The SS solution was methodical. They evacuated those who could walk in a death march to Buchenwald, 30 miles away. Those too weak to march, they shot. When soldiers of the 89th Infantry Division and the 4th Armored Division entered Ohrdruf on April 4th, they found hundreds of corpses in various stages of decomposition, bodies stacked in sheds, bodies piled, near railroad tracks. Bodies partially burned on improvised pyres where the SS, in their final hours of control, had tried frantically to destroy evidence. Private David Cohen, serving with the 4th Armored Division, entered a shed and stopped in the doorway, unable to process what he was seeing. Later, when asked to describe it, he said the bodies were piled up like cordwood. There are no words to describe it. The smell was overpowering and unforgettable. That metaphor, bodies stacked like wood, appears again and again in soldier accounts from Ohrdruf and other camps. It's revealing in what it attempts to do. By comparing human remains to objects, to lumber arranged for storage, soldiers tried to create cognitive distance from what they were actually seeing. People, thousands of people, starved to skeletal frames, murdered, and discarded. The psychological mechanism is understandable, recognizing each body as fully human, as someone who had a name and a family and a life before. This place would have been mentally debilitating for men who still had combat missions to complete. So they reached for comparisons that dehumanized the victims in their descriptions, not out of cruelty, but out of desperate psychological need to maintain their own sanity. The few surviving prisoners found at Ohrdruf could barely stand. American medics, accustomed to treating combat wounds, found themselves confronting medical conditions they'd never encountered: extreme starvation, typhus, tuberculosis, infections from beatings and torture. Men who weighed perhaps 70 pounds, their bodies consuming themselves to stay alive for just one more day. One prisoner, an Austrian Jew who spoke some English, approached the American soldiers and offered to show them the camp's facilities. He led them to gallows where prisoners had been hanged, to a room filled with implements of torture, to mass graves in the surrounding woods. The soldiers followed, photographing everything, taking notes, trying to create a documentary record of what seemed impossible. News of the discovery travelled quickly up the command chain. Within days, the report reached General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. Eisenhower, directing the final conquest of Germany from his headquarters in Reims, read the initial descriptions from Ohrdruf with growing horror. He cabled General George Patton, whose Third Army had liberated the camp. "I'm coming to see this myself." April 12, 1945. General Eisenhower arrived at Ohrdruf, accompanied by Generals Bradley and George Patton, along with military photographers and a Stars and Stripes reporter. The Austrian Jewish prisoner who had first shown the camp to American soldiers a week earlier served as their guide. What followed was one of the most documented moments of the camp liberations. Eisenhower, his face described by witnesses as frozen white, forced himself to examine every part of the camp. He walked slowly through areas where corpses lay in the open. He stood beside a pyre where bodies had been partially burned, charred remains still visible on railroad track sections used as improvised cremation grills. He watched as the prisoner guide demonstrated torture techniques the SS guards had employed. Bradley stood beside him, visibly revolted. Patton, the famously profane warrior who had led armoured divisions across North Africa and Europe, who had earned the nickname Old Blood and Guts for his aggressive leadership style, walked behind a building and vomited. Later, when shown a shed filled with perhaps 40 completely naked bodies in the last stages of emaciation, bodies lightly sprinkled with lime in a futile attempt to mask the stench, Patton refused to enter. He told Eisenhower he would get sick if he did so. Eisenhower entered anyway. He later explained his reasoning in a cable to General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff in Washington. "I made the visit deliberately, in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." Think about that statement. Eisenhower, standing in a shed filled with murdered prisoners, watching Patton vomit from the horror, already understood that future generations might doubt what happened here, might claim it was exaggerated, might dismiss the evidence as wartime propaganda. So he forced himself to look at everything, to bear witness personally, to become himself a piece of evidence. After touring the camp, Eisenhower stood with Bradley and Patton near the entrance. His face was grim. His voice, when he spoke, carried an anger that those who knew him well said they'd rarely heard. "I want every American unit not actually in the front lines to see this place. We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." That same day, Eisenhower ordered American troops from all units in the area, thousands of men, to tour Ohrdruf. They came in shifts, walking through the camp in silence, photographing, taking notes, trying to comprehend. Many of them broke down. Some became violently ill. All of them were changed by what they saw. Bradley, writing later in Life magazine, tried to capture the sensory assault of Ohrdruf. The smell of death overwhelmed us even before we passed through the stockade. More than 3,200 naked, emaciated bodies had been flung into shallow graves. Others lay in the streets where they had fallen. Lice crawled over the yellowed skin of their sharp, bony frames. Eisenhower went further. On April 19th, 1 week after his visit to Ohrdruf, he cabled Marshall with an urgent request. Members of Congress should come to Germany. Journalists, editors, publishers, anyone with the ability to tell the American public what was happening. The things I saw beggar description, Eisenhower wrote. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. I have visited one of these myself, and I assure you that whatever has been printed on them to date has been an understatement. Marshall, understanding the gravity of what Eisenhower was reporting, immediately organized delegations. Within days, congressional representatives and journalists were boarding planes for Germany. They would tour not just Ohrdruf, but other camps being liberated in rapid succession as American forces pushed deeper into German territory. The citizens of Ohrdruf, the German civilians living within sight and smell of the camp, were also brought to see what had been done in their name. Eisenhower ordered that every resident of the nearby town, dressed in their best clothing, be marched through the camp and forced to look at the evidence, to stand beside the piles of bodies, to witness what they later claimed they'd never known existed. The mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife, after touring the camp, returned to their home and hanged themselves, whether from shame or fear of prosecution, or simply the inability to face what they had seen, no one can say definitively. But their deaths added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible situation. Ohrdruf was not the worst camp, it was not the largest, it was not where the most systematic killing occurred. It was, in American experience, simply the first. And what the soldiers and generals discovered there on April 4th and 12th, 1945, was just the beginning of a month that would fundamentally alter how Americans understood the war they were fighting. Because Ohrdruf was a subcamp of Buchenwald, and on April 11th, just days after Eisenhower's visit to Ohrdruf, American forces would reach Buchenwald itself, a main camp, operational since 1937, where more than 250,000 people had been imprisoned, over 8 years, where torture and medical experiments and systematic starvation had killed tens of thousands, where the machinery of genocide had operated with bureaucratic efficiency for nearly the entire duration of Nazi rule. The liberation of Buchenwald followed a different pattern than Ohrdruf. On the morning of April 11th, as units from the 6th Armored Division, part of Patton's Third Army, approached the camp, the SS guards received orders to evacuate. By 10 in the morning, all SS personnel were ordered to leave. The International Camp Committee, a resistance organization of prisoners, mobilized fighters who had hidden weapons and distributed them. Around noon, the SS commanding officers fled. Guards abandoned the watchtowers. By 2:30 in the afternoon, tanks from the 4th Armored Division rolled through the SS complex without stopping. The SS fled entirely. Armed prisoners took control of the camp and overpowered the last remaining guards. By 4 in the afternoon, the prisoners controlled Buchenwald. About 1 hour later, scouts from the 4th and 6th Armored Divisions became the first American soldiers to reach the camp itself. What they found was different from Ohrdruf. At Buchenwald, there were survivors. More than 21,000 prisoners, most in desperate condition but alive. Men who had endured years of imprisonment, who had seen hundreds of thousands pass through the camp, most to their deaths. Men who could testify, who could explain what had happened here, who could guide the Americans through the evidence. Andrew Kinneary, a member of the 45th Evacuation Hospital attached to Patton's Third Army, arrived at Buchenwald between April 28th and May 11th. He was not among the first to enter, but what he witnessed during his time there challenged his comprehension in ways that decades later he still struggled to articulate. You couldn't grasp it all, he told interviewers from the National World War II Museum. I can't really describe it, to tell you how horrendous it was to see these people treated like animals. Even worse than that. Kinneary recalled the bodies. Human beings totally bereft of life, piled in trenches or stacked on carts. And the stench. The overwhelming smell of death that permeated every part of the camp. I don't think they told us what we were getting into, he said. How could they? How do you prepare soldiers for evidence of industrial-scale murder? The camp's crematorium still contained human ashes. Warehouses held possessions stolen from prisoners: shoes, clothing, eyeglasses, luggage, all sorted and catalogued with German bureaucratic precision. The sick barracks contained men too ill to stand, suffering from typhus and tuberculosis, and starvation-related diseases that Allied doctors had never seen in such concentration. But at Buchenwald, unlike Ohrdruf, there were also witnesses, prisoners who could explain the camp's hierarchy, its administration, its methods, who could identify guards, who could describe specific murders, specific tortures, specific procedures. This testimony, collected by American investigators in the weeks after liberation, would become crucial evidence in the Nuremberg trials and subsequent war crimes prosecutions. Among those collecting testimony was Edward Tenenbaum, a first lieutenant with the Psychological Warfare Division, and Egon Fleck, a civilian. On April 24th, they released a report about what they'd uncovered at Buchenwald. The document, forwarded to headquarters, 12th Army Group under General Bradley's command, detailed the camp's operation with chilling precision. The administrative systems, the labor assignments, the punishment procedures, the methods of killing. Clinton Gardner arrived at Buchenwald a week after liberation, just 22 years old, wounded at Omaha Beach, and again during the Battle of the Bulge. He'd seen plenty of horror in the 10 months prior to his arrival, but it was a very different sort of horror. Combat, with all its violence and death, operated under certain rules. This was something else entirely. Gardner was charged with helping set up an administration for the approximately 20,000 to 21,000 former prisoners still in the camp. He spoke French well, and knew enough German to communicate. He worked with Hans Eiden, the camp elder who had become the unofficial leader of Buchenwald when the SS fled on April 11th. Together, they tried to organize the massive humanitarian crisis, food distribution, medical care, repatriation for survivors from dozens of countries. The challenge was immense. Many prisoners were too weak to eat solid food. Their systems, adapted to months or years of starvation rations, couldn't process normal meals. Medical teams had to carefully regulate feeding, starting with thin soups and gradually introducing more substantial nutrition. Even so, hundreds continued to die in the weeks after liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover. Other prisoners faced different challenges. Many were Jews whose families had been murdered, whose homes had been confiscated, whose communities had been destroyed. Others were political prisoners from occupied countries, communists and socialists, and resistance fighters who had survived the camps only to face uncertain futures in a post-war Europe that hadn't yet been defined. On April 19th, thousands of prisoners gathered for a remarkable moment. Hermann Brill, a socialist who had survived years of imprisonment, proclaimed the Buchenwald Manifesto, a 10-point plan calling for political freedom, the extirpation of Nazi elements from German society, the unity of all anti-fascist forces, and the abolition of capitalism. The American authorities, uncomfortable with the radical political content, would later prohibit May Day demonstrations and confiscate red flags displaying the hammer and sickle. But that moment on April 19th, when prisoners who had survived the Nazi extermination system stood together demanding a better world, represented something crucial. These were not just victims. They were people, political actors. Human beings who had endured unspeakable cruelty and emerged determined to ensure it could never happen again. Meanwhile, other units of the American army continued advancing through Germany, and they continued discovering camps, Dora Mittelbau, Nordhausen, dozens of subcamps and satellites of larger systems. Each discovery brought fresh horror. Each liberation revealed new evidence of systematic atrocity. And then, on April 29, 1945, American forces liberated Dachau. Dachau was different from Ohrdruf and Buchenwald in significant ways. It was older, established in March 1933, just weeks after Hitler became Chancellor. It was the first Nazi concentration camp, the prototype whose design and procedures would be replicated across occupied Europe. The mocking Arbeit macht frei, sign above the gates, work makes you free, would appear at camp entrances from Poland to France. The separate barracks for medical experiments, the torture rooms, the crematorium design, all originated here. For 12 years, Dachau had operated as a central component of Nazi terror. Initially established to imprison political opponents, trade unionists and communists and social democrats, it expanded over time to include Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, Roma and Sinti people, and eventually large numbers of Jews. After Kristallnacht in November 1938, more than 10,000 Jewish men were imprisoned at Dachau in a single week. By April 1945, as American forces approached Munich, the SS guards at Dachau faced the same problem their counterparts at other camps confronted. Too many prisoners, not enough time to evacuate or eliminate them all. The SS forced more than 7,000 prisoners, mostly Jews, onto death. Marches heading south toward Tegernsee. Those too weak to continue were shot on the roadside. Many others died of exhaustion, starvation, or exposure during the march. On April 29, soldiers from 3 American divisions converged on Dachau. The 42nd Rainbow Infantry Division, under Major General Harry Collins, the 45th Thunderbird Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Robert Frederick, and the 27th Tank Battalion of the 20th Armored Division. These were experienced units, battle-hardened through months of combat, accustomed to violence and death in all its forms. They were not prepared for Dachau. The first indication something was wrong came, as it had at Ohrdruf, from the smell. Soldiers approaching the camp area reported an acrid odour that some compared to chemical factories, others to burning feathers or rotting meat. Those who had liberated Ohrdruf recognized it immediately. Death, on an industrial scale. Then they found the train, 39 railroad cars sitting on tracks near the camp, containing approximately 2,310 corpses. Prisoners who had been loaded onto the train at Buchenwald weeks earlier, intended for transfer to Dachau. The journey that should have taken days had lasted 3 weeks. The SS guards had not provided food or water. They'd opened the sealed cattle cars occasionally to remove bodies and shoot anyone who tried to escape. By the time the train reached Dachau, only a quarter of its original 3,000 passengers remained alive. American soldiers walked alongside the train cars, looking into them, and had to turn away. The bodies, piled on top of each other, were in advanced states of decomposition. The smell was overwhelming. Many soldiers vomited. Some broke down completely. These were men who had fought through Normandy, through the Battle of the Bulge, through weeks of brutal combat across Germany. They had seen their friends killed, had killed enemy. Soldiers themselves had witnessed the destruction of war in countless forms, but nothing had prepared them for this, for evidence that human beings had deliberately, systematically, bureaucratically murdered thousands of people and left their bodies to rot in railway cars. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Jack Westbrook, serving with the 222nd Infantry Regiment of the 42nd Division, later wrote that up until April 29, 1945, the majority of us in my unit were not aware of the Nazi efforts to exterminate the Jews, certainly not its scope nor its effect on the world, and certainly none of us were aware of the Dachau concentration camp. That statement is revealing. These were soldiers fighting in Germany in the final weeks of the war. They knew they were fighting Nazis. They knew about German atrocities in general terms. But the specific reality of the extermination camps, the systematic industrial murder of millions, remained largely unknown to frontline troops until they saw it with their own eyes. The liberation of Dachau itself followed a complex and controversial sequence. The camp consisted of 3 separate areas: the German village of Dachau, the SS training compound and barracks, and the concentration camp proper. As American forces approached, fighting erupted at the SS barracks. Soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 157th Infantry Regiment fought their way through, encountering resistance from SS guards who initially fired on the advancing Americans. At the main camp gate, Brigadier General Henning Linden and soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, 222nd Infantry, approached to find 3 people waiting with a white flag. a Swiss Red Cross representative named Victor Maurer, and 2 SS troopers who identified themselves as the camp commander, SS Lieutenant Heinrich Wicker, and his assistant. They had arrived the night of the 28th to take over from regular personnel for the purpose of surrendering the camp to advancing Americans. The Americans entered the camp and found more than 32,000 surviving prisoners crammed into facilities designed for far fewer. These prisoners, many barely alive, had endured conditions that beg a description: starvation, disease, random beatings, medical experiments, forced labor until collapse. They had watched tens of thousands of their fellow prisoners die and had themselves survived through luck and will, and sometimes at the expense of others, because in the camps, survival often required moral compromises that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. But the Americans also found more death. Beyond the railroad cars outside the camp, beyond the emaciated living prisoners, they discovered the crematorium, a building that contained not just the ovens where bodies had been burned, but a storage shed filled with corpses waiting for cremation. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Fellens, commander of the 1st Battalion, 222nd Infantry, reported finding over 4,000 bodies, men, women, and children, in a warehouse near the crematorium. There were over 1,000 additional dead bodies in the barracks within the enclosure. Major Ailey Bonan, assistant chaplain with the 42nd Division, wrote home on May 1st. "Nothing you can put in words would adequately describe what I saw there. The human mind refuses to believe what the eyes see. All the stories of Nazi horrors are underestimated rather than exaggerated. That last sentence is crucial." Bonan, like many Americans, had heard reports about Nazi atrocities, but like most people, he had assumed the stories were exaggerated for propaganda purposes. Now, standing in Dachau, he realized the opposite was true. The reality was worse than anything reported. Language itself was inadequate to convey the full horror. What happened next at Dachau remains one of the most controversial aspects of the liberation. American soldiers, confronting the evidence of systematic murder, the bodies stacked in warehouses, the emaciated survivors, the railroad cars filled with corpses, lost control. Some SS guards who surrendered were shot. Estimates vary, but approximately 35 to 50 SS men were killed by American soldiers in what can only be described as summary executions. Others were killed by inmates, some of whom were given weapons or encouraged by American troops. Lieutenant Bill Walsh witnessed prisoners beating a German guard to death with a shovel while American soldiers turned away. Another soldier watched an inmate stomp on an SS trooper's face until there wasn't much left. When the soldier said to him, "You've got a lot of hate in your heart," the prisoner simply nodded. These killings were war crimes, clear violations of the laws of war regarding treatment of prisoners. But they occurred in a context that makes simple moral judgments difficult. These were soldiers who moments earlier had walked past thousands of corpses, who had seen the crematorium ovens, who had looked into the eyes of survivors weighing 70 pounds, who had confronted evidence that the guards they were now shooting had participated in systematic murder. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker, the 7th Army's Assistant Inspector General, was ordered to investigate after witnesses reported the killings. He issued a report on June 8, 1945, documenting what had occurred. But Colonel Charles Decker, acting Deputy Judge Advocate, concluded that while the killings appeared to violate international law, extenuating circumstances warranted dropping the case without charges. It appears there was a violation of the letter of international law in that the SS guards seemed to have been shot without trial, Decker wrote. But in light of the conditions which greeted the eyes of the first combat troops to reach Dachau, it is not believed that justice or equity demand that the difficult and perhaps impossible task of fixing individual responsibility now be undertaken. For the surviving prisoners at Dachau, for the prisoners at Buchenwald and Ohrdruf, and dozens of other camps being liberated in those final weeks of April 1945, the arrival of American troops meant survival. It meant food, though many were too weak to eat. It meant medical care, though hundreds would die anyway, their bodies too damaged to recover. It meant freedom, though for many that freedom came with impossible questions. Where do I go? The immediate aftermath of liberation posed enormous challenges. Tens of thousands of displaced persons, many seriously ill, requiring food, medical attention, and eventually repatriation or resettlement. American military units, trained for combat, found themselves administering humanitarian relief on a massive scale with minimal preparation. Lee Miller, a photographer and war correspondent, arrived at Buchenwald days after its liberation. She had reconnected with the U.S. Army during their eastward advance and hitched a ride when she heard a concentration camp had been liberated. Walking through Buchenwald, photographing the evidence, talking with survivors, she understood immediately that people back home might not believe what she was documenting. She cabled her editor at British Vogue, "I implore you to believe this is true." Miller moved on to Dachau, arriving on April 30th, the day after liberation, among the first war correspondents to enter the camp. She noted that soldiers had been encouraged to take pictures and relay details to friends and families back home, fearing the grotesque truth would not be believed by those who hadn't seen it firsthand. But the plan failed. So many really tough guys had become sick it was interfering with duties. The photographs Miller and other correspondents took at Dachau and Buchenwald and other camps would be published in American and British magazines within weeks. The images shocked readers who had followed the war for years but had never seen anything like this. Emaciated prisoners staring at cameras, bodies stacked in warehouses, crematorium ovens, the physical evidence of systematic extermination. Eisenhower's insistence on documentation, on bringing journalists and congressmen and photographers to witness the camps, ensured that the liberation would be recorded in exhaustive detail. Approximately 80,000 feet of film was shot by U.S. Army Signal Corps photographers. Thousands of still photographs were taken. Written testimonies were collected from hundreds of survivors. All of it would become evidence not just of what had happened, but of Allied forces' efforts to document and publicize it. The documentation served another crucial purpose. It countered the denials already beginning. German civilians living near the camps claimed they didn't know what was happening behind the fences. Eisenhower had little patience for such claims. His granddaughter Susan later explained that he believed if German citizens didn't know what was taking place, they were closing their eyes to the world they had helped create. So, American military authorities forced German civilians to tour the camps, to look at the bodies, to help bury the dead. In town after town near liberated camps, German citizens were marched through the evidence of what had been done in their name. Some wept, some vomited, some maintained expressions of shocked disbelief, but they all saw. They could never again claim ignorance. The photographs and newsreels shocked America, but they were just images on paper or flickering on screens. The soldiers who witnessed the camps firsthand carried something different. They carried memories that couldn't be put down, smells that wouldn't fade, sights that invaded their dreams. Decades later, Seymour Kaplan, riding in that jeep to Dachau on April 29, 1945, thought it was just a town. He had heard the name, but didn't know what waited there. When he entered the camp and saw bodies stacked 7 feet high, lying like sacks of potatoes, only some had slid down to form half a pyramid, his mind recorded it with photographic clarity. Then, for 50 years, he didn't recall the vision, didn't speak about it, couldn't access the memory even when he tried. This was not unusual. Thousands of American soldiers who liberated concentration camps came home and never spoke about what they'd seen. Their wives didn't know. Their children grew up unaware that their fathers had witnessed the worst crimes in human history. The silence wasn't a choice, exactly. It was psychological necessity, a defense mechanism that allowed men to function, to work, to raise families, to live normal lives, while carrying memories of the abnormal and the inhuman. Alan Moskin, who helped liberate Gunskirchen, a subcamp of Mauthausen in Austria, on May 4, 1945, remembered the stench above all else. "I can still smell it every time I talk about it," he said decades later. It was so powerful. That sensory memory, triggered by discussion, proved more lasting than visual recall. The smell of death, of decomposing bodies, of human waste and disease and starvation, it imprinted itself on neural pathways in ways that words couldn't erase. The psychological impact on liberators wasn't recognized for decades. After World War II, the military had no framework for understanding what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Battle fatigue was recognized. Combat stress reaction. The immediate psychological breakdown that could occur during or shortly after combat. But the long-term effects of witnessing atrocity, the way trauma could lie dormant for years before manifesting, this wasn't understood until much later. It wasn't until, after Vietnam, that the Veterans Administration began examining PTSD seriously, how traumatic experiences have psychological consequences that can last for decades. And even then, the focus was primarily on combat trauma. The specific trauma of witnessing genocide, of seeing evidence of systematic industrial murder, this remained understudied and under-recognized. Eva Fogelman, a psychologist who studied the liberators' experiences, explained that a lot has been written about the PTSD suffered by survivors, but very little has been written about the experience of the liberators and how traumatic it was to liberate those camps. The soldiers, like many Holocaust survivors, did not speak about their experiences and were not asked. Very few wives knew what their husbands experienced in World War II. The silence was compounded by a unique form of guilt. The liberators came into a situation where they saw so many people near death, and they felt helpless. They had no medication. Some, liberators who had food with them, fed these people, which killed some. The prisoners' digestive systems, adapted to starvation, couldn't process normal food. Well-meaning American soldiers, trying to help, gave starving prisoners rations or chocolate and watched them die from the sudden intake of food their bodies couldn't handle. They had meant well, but they felt responsible for having killed them. This guilt, this sense of having failed to save everyone, even after liberation, added another layer to the trauma. Soldiers who had survived combat without breaking, who had killed enemy soldiers without losing their sanity, found themselves psychologically shattered by the camps, not by what they had done, but by what they had witnessed, by what they had failed to prevent or adequately address. The scope of liberator trauma is difficult to quantify precisely, but researchers estimate that approximately 250,000 American service members witnessed concentration camps, or their subcamps. General Eisenhower's order that every battalion within 50 miles of a discovered camp send soldiers to be witnesses meant that tens of thousands of men saw the evidence, even if they hadn't participated in the actual liberation. These men returned to America in 1945 and 1946. They went to college on the WWII Bill. They married, had children, built careers. Many became successful in business or the professions. They lived what appeared to be normal, productive lives, but many carried silent wounds that manifested in ways their families couldn't understand. Depression, anger, emotional distance, night terrors, reactions to certain smells or sights that seemed disproportionate to their triggers. One liberator's daughter described finding her father's photographs from the war after his death. She'd known he served, but he'd never discussed the details. At the bottom of a box, she found images of emaciated prisoners, of bodies stacked in, sheds, of survivors barely alive. Her father had carried these photographs his entire life but never showed them to anyone, never spoke about them, just kept them, evidence of something he couldn't articulate but couldn't forget. The documentation that Eisenhower ordered served another crucial purpose beyond countering Holocaust denial. It created a historical record of unprecedented detail. The photographs, the newsreels, the written testimonies, all of it ensured that future generations would have access to evidence of what happened, not filtered through memory or reinterpreted through ideology, but documented in the immediate aftermath by soldiers and journalists who saw it firsthand. Edward R. Murrow, the renowned CBS radio correspondent who had reported from London during the Blitz, arrived at Buchenwald on April 12, 1945, the day after liberation. He was among the first journalists to enter the camp. What he saw there shocked him so profoundly that he delayed his broadcast for 3 days, trying to maintain some professional detachment, trying to find words adequate to the task. On April 15th, Murrow delivered what would become one of the most famous radio broadcasts of World War II. His voice, transmitted to millions of American listeners, carried both rage and sorrow. "Permit me to tell you what you would have seen and heard had you been with me on Thursday," he began. "It will not be pleasant listening. If you are at lunch, or if you have no appetite to hear what Germans have done, now is a good time to switch off the radio, for I propose to tell you of Buchenwald." Murrow described walking through the camp, surrounded by an evil-smelling stink. Men and boys reached out to touch him. They were in rags and the remnants of uniforms. Death had already marked many of them, but they were smiling with their eyes. He asked to see one of the barracks, which happened to be occupied by Czechoslovaks. When he entered, men crowded around, tried to lift him to their shoulders. They were too weak. What distinguished Murrow's broadcast from other journalistic accounts was his focus on the prisoners as people. While other reporters described dumps of unburied corpses and wretched remnants, Murrow tried to convey the humanity of the inmates. He described individual interactions, conversations, attempts at connection. He was trying to make his listeners understand that these weren't just victims or statistics. They were men who had lives before their imprisonment, who had families and professions and hopes. His report described the physical evidence methodically. The crematorium, with its ovens. The warehouses filled with possessions. The bodies stacked like cordwood. That phrase again, the attempt to create cognitive distance from horror through metaphor. But Murrow's anger came through clearly, when he described looking out over the camp to the green fields beyond, where well-fed Germans were ploughing as if nothing unusual was happening nearby. His contempt was palpable. He ended his broadcast with a statement that revealed both his certainty about the importance of the story and his anger at listeners who might doubt it. "If I have offended you by this rather mild account of Buchenwald, I'm not in the least sorry." The word mild is crucial. Murrow understood that he'd presented only a fraction of the full horror. That language itself was inadequate to convey what he'd witnessed, that the reality exceeded anything his words could communicate. Murrow returned to London with the smell of death on his uniform, according to colleagues. He was shaken in ways that his years of war reporting, including flying on bombing raids over Germany and broadcasting during London's bombardment, had never shaken him. A fellow broadcaster later said that after Buchenwald, Murrow seemed changed, more somber, less willing to accept easy answers or comfortable narratives about the war. His broadcast had an enormous impact. Millions of Americans heard it live. Many more heard it in subsequent rebroadcasts or read transcripts in newspapers. For Americans who had followed the war primarily through sanitized news reports and government communiques, Murrow's description brought home the reality of Nazi atrocities in ways that abstract numbers never could. But Murrow's report, like most American media coverage of the liberation, had a significant omission. He never mentioned Jews. Despite the fact that the majority of victims in the camps were Jewish, despite the reality that the Holocaust was specifically directed at the extermination of European Jewry, American news reports tended to describe victims as political prisoners, or simply as inmates, or as various nationalities. The specific targeting of Jews for genocide was mentioned rarely, if at all, in immediate liberation coverage. This wasn't unique to Murrow. Most American journalists covering the liberations failed to identify Jews as the primary victims. Partly, this reflected the complexity of the camps themselves. Places like Buchenwald and Dachau imprisoned many different categories of victims: political prisoners, resistance fighters, homosexuals, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, criminals, and Jews. The SS administrative systems categorized prisoners by various designations, and liberating soldiers encountered this diversity without immediately understanding the underlying genocidal purpose specifically directed at Jews. But the omission also reflected broader patterns in American media coverage throughout the war. Stories about the systematic murder of Jews appeared in American newspapers from 1941 onward, but they were typically buried on inside pages, treated as secondary news, or presented with skepticism about whether reports could be accurate. The full scope of the Holocaust, the fact that this was genocide specifically targeting the Jewish people, didn't become clear in American public consciousness until well after the war ended. The immediate aftermath of liberation posed staggering humanitarian challenges. Tens of thousands of displaced persons, most severely ill, all needing food, medical care, and eventually somewhere to go. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, working with occupying American, British, and French forces, established displaced persons camps. These were not concentration camps, but temporary facilities where survivors could recover and wait for resettlement opportunities. Many survivors faced impossible choices about where to go. Jews whose families had been murdered, whose communities had been destroyed, often couldn't return to their former homes. In post-war Poland, anti-Semitism remained virulent. When some Jews returned to their hometowns seeking to reclaim property or find surviving relatives, they faced violence. The largest post-war pogrom occurred in Kielce, Poland, in July 1946, when Polish rioters killed at least 42 Jews and beat many others. Palestine offered one possibility for resettlement, but British authorities, controlling the Mandate territory, severely restricted Jewish immigration. Ships carrying Holocaust survivors attempting to reach Palestine were intercepted and turned back. The most famous case was the Exodus 1947, carrying 4,500 survivors. British forces boarded the ship, forcibly removed the passengers, and returned them to detention camps in Germany. The bitter irony of Holocaust survivors being forcibly returned to Germany shocked world opinion and contributed to growing pressure for a Jewish homeland. The United States, despite being the liberator of many camps, also restricted immigration. American immigration quotas remained in place through the late 1940s. Jewish survivors seeking entry to the United States often waited years in displaced persons camps. Eventually, changes to immigration law in 1948 allowed more refugees to enter, but by then thousands had spent 3 or more years in limbo, liberated but not free to build new lives. The long-term impact of witnessing the camps extended beyond individual soldiers to American society as a whole. The documentation that Eisenhower ordered ensured that Americans could not claim ignorance about Nazi atrocities. The photographs appeared in magazines nationwide. Newsreels played in movie theaters. Congressional delegations toured camps and reported back to the American public. This created a collective awareness, however incomplete, of what had been discovered. This awareness shaped American participation in the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The evidence collected by American military investigators in the camps, the photographs and testimonies and documentary records, became crucial courtroom evidence. Former camp commandants and guards were tried in special tribunals. Many were executed. Others received prison sentences. The Dachau trials, conducted by the American military from November 1945 through August 1947, prosecuted personnel from Dachau and its subcamps. Former Commandant Martin Weiss was among those executed. The trials established legal precedents about individual responsibility for participation in systematic atrocity. Following orders was not accepted as a defense. Guards who had staffed the camps, administrators who had kept the records, doctors who had conducted medical experiments, all were held accountable for their actions. But justice for the dead could only go so far. No number of executions or prison sentences could restore the murdered to life. No reparations could compensate for families destroyed, communities erased, cultures obliterated. The survivors who testified at trials carried their trauma forward into futures that would never be free from the past. Research into the long-term psychological effects on Holocaust survivors has documented patterns of chronic PTSD at rates significantly higher than those found in war veterans. Studies conducted decades after the war found that 46% of Holocaust survivors met diagnostic criteria for PTSD. The most common symptoms were sleep disturbance, recurrent nightmares, and intense distress over reminders. These symptoms persisted 50 years after liberation, 60 years, even 70 years later. The specific nature of Holocaust trauma, combining dehumanization, confrontation with death, and massive loss over prolonged periods, created psychological wounds that didn't heal with time. Survivors who had been tattooed at Auschwitz, who bore permanent physical marks of their imprisonment, showed significantly higher rates of PTSD than those who had survived through hiding or other means. The trauma was both psychological and neurological, creating lasting changes in brain structure that researchers could identify through imaging studies decades later. Many survivors never received adequate psychiatric care. In the decades immediately after the war, mental health systems were not equipped to address trauma of this magnitude. Some survivors dealt with their experiences through silence, compartmentalizing the horror and focusing on building new lives. They married, had children, pursued careers, created the outward appearance of normalcy while carrying memories that invaded their thoughts and dreams. Dr. Paul Heller, the Czech physician who showed Edward R. Murrow through Buchenwald on April 12, 1945, embodied this pattern. He survived multiple camps, including Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, and Gross Rosen. After liberation, Murrow helped him immigrate to the United States, found him a place to live, ensured his medical career could continue. The two men became close friends, but Heller rarely spoke about his experiences. His daughter Caroline grew up feeling enormously protective of her parents without understanding why. She knew Murrow was a family friend, had given her gifts as a baby, but she didn't understand the connection until years later, when she heard a rebroadcast of Murrow's report from Buchenwald and heard her father's name mentioned. Paul Heller compartmentalized his trauma, focusing intensely on his work as a physician and researcher. When he locked himself in his study, he stayed there for hours, with the door closed and the air conditioner running whether it was cold or not, his daughter remembered. The sound blocked out the world, protected him from memories he couldn't process even decades after liberation. Near the end of his life, Heller visited Murrow on his deathbed. The two men, bonded by those terrible days in April 1945, talked about how everyone experiences moments in hell. Murrow had seen Heller's hell in Buchenwald. Now Heller was seeing Murrow's hell as cancer consumed him. Both men died carrying memories of horror that shaped everything that came after. The question posed by the title of this narrative, "What happened when Allied troops discovered the concentration camps?" has an answer that unfolds across multiple timescales. In the immediate moment, what happened was shock, horror, rage, and incomprehension. Soldiers who had fought through the most violent war in history confronted something worse than combat: evidence of systematic industrial murder. Proof that human beings could organize bureaucracies specifically designed to dehumanize and kill other human beings with ruthless efficiency. In the days and weeks after liberation, what happened was a massive humanitarian effort to save survivors, document crimes, and begin the process of holding perpetrators accountable. Military units not trained for humanitarian work became relief agencies. Combat soldiers became nurses, quartermasters became aid distributors. The American military, along with British and other Allied forces, improvised responses to a crisis that exceeded any planning or preparation. In the months and years after liberation, what happened was the slow, painful process of survivors trying to rebuild lives from ruins, of displaced persons, camps filled with people who couldn't go home because home no longer existed, of legal proceedings that established precedents about crimes against humanity while providing cold comfort to those who had lost everything, of soldiers returning to civilian life, carrying memories they couldn't share and trauma they couldn't name. In the decades after liberation, what happened was the gradual recognition of the Holocaust as a specific historical event with particular characteristics. The understanding that this wasn't just wartime atrocity in general, but genocide specifically directed at the Jewish people. The documentation of 6 million Jewish deaths, along with millions of others murdered in camps and killing sites across Nazi-occupied Europe. The creation of memorials and museums and educational programs intended to ensure that such crimes could never happen again. And in the lifetimes of liberators and survivors, what happened was the carrying forward of memories that shaped everything. Soldiers who went on to successful careers but woke from nightmares about bodies stacked in sheds. Survivors who built new families but couldn't speak about the families they lost. Children and grandchildren who grew up in households shadowed by unspoken trauma, who sensed their parents' or grandparents' pain without understanding its source. Tom Sitter, who helped liberate Dachau on April 29, 1945, lived to be 97 years old. 70 years after the liberation, he spoke to soldiers at Fort McCoy about his experiences. As we were heading south toward Munich, he told them, 10 miles northwest of Munich was a town we had never heard of, the infamous town of Dachau. We were not prepared for this. That last sentence captures something essential. No preparation could have readied them for what they found. No training could have equipped them to process it. No prior experience, no matter how violent or traumatic, created a framework for understanding systematic genocide. The liberators did their jobs. They secured the camps, disarmed the guards, provided what aid they could to survivors. They documented what they found with photographs and film and written reports. They testified at trials. Some spoke publicly about their experiences, trying to ensure the world would know and remember. Others carried their knowledge silently, unable to articulate what they'd witnessed. But all of them were changed, irrevocably altered by confronting evidence of what human beings can do to other human beings when ideology removes moral constraints and bureaucracy enables systematic murder. They had entered the camps as soldiers. They left as witnesses to the worst crime in human history. The legacy of that witnessing extends to the present. The photographs taken by military photographers in April and May 1945 remain among the most powerful evidence of the Holocaust. The testimonies collected from survivors in those first weeks after liberation preserve voices that might otherwise have been lost. The newsreels and broadcasts that brought images of the camps to American audiences created a public record that makes denial difficult, though not impossible. Eisenhower's insistence on documentation proved prescient. Holocaust deniers who attempt to claim that the genocide never happened, or that reports of it are exaggerated, must confront the massive official record that Eisenhower ordered assembled. Thousands of photographs taken by military photographers, hours of film footage, written reports from thousands of witnesses, testimony from both liberators and survivors, physical evidence from the camps themselves. The concentration camps that American forces liberated in April and May 1945 stand now as memorials and museums. Dachau receives hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. Buchenwald, located in what was East Germany during the Cold War, became a memorial site that successive German governments have maintained as a reminder of what must never happen again. The sites are preserved not in their liberation state, but as places of memory and education. Walking through Buchenwald today, visitors see the barracks foundations, the crematorium building, the pathways that prisoners walked. They see the memorial inscriptions in multiple languages. They see the exhibits that explain the camp's history and operation. What they cannot see is what the liberators saw: the bodies, the starving prisoners, the full sensory assault of death and disease. The preserved site is sanitized, made suitable for educational purposes, stripped of the visceral horror that characterized April 11, 1945. This creates both opportunity and limitation. The memorial sites serve crucial educational functions, teaching new generations about the Holocaust, preserving memory, honoring victims. But they cannot fully convey what Private David Cohen experienced when he walked into that shed at Ohrdruf and saw bodies piled up like wood. They cannot recreate the smell that Alan Moskin can still recall 70 years later. They cannot transmit the psychological shock that caused General Patton to vomit and turn away. The witnesses are dying now. The soldiers who liberated the camps are in their 90s and 100s, their numbers diminishing each year. The survivors, those who were imprisoned in the camps and lived to see liberation, are also aging into their final years. Soon there will be no living witnesses to the events of April 1945. Only the documentary record, the photographs and films and written testimonies, will remain. This makes the work of preservation and education more urgent. The first-hand accounts must be recorded while witnesses are still alive. The nuances of experience, the details that don't appear in official reports, the personal stories that make abstract numbers comprehensible as human tragedy, all of this must be preserved before it's lost. But even the most comprehensive preservation efforts cannot fully capture what happened when Allied troops discovered the concentration camps. Because what happened wasn't just a historical event that can be documented and analysed. It was a collision between human expectation and inhuman reality. It was the moment when thousands of American soldiers, and eventually millions of American civilians, confronted proof that the unthinkable was not only possible, but had actually occurred. The soldiers who entered Ohrdruf and Buchenwald and Dachau in April 1945 expected to find prison camps, perhaps harsh conditions, perhaps evidence of mistreatment. They did not expect to find evidence of systematic extermination, industrial-scale murder, bodies stacked in sheds and burned on pyres and left to rot in railway cars. Survivors so emaciated that they barely appeared human, a machinery of death so comprehensive and efficient that it challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and civilization. What they said, when they could speak at all, was inadequate to the task. You couldn't grasp it all. I can't really describe it. The human mind refuses to believe what the eyes see. There are no words. These fragments appear again and again in accounts from liberators, the acknowledgement that language itself fails in the face of such horror. What they did was document, photograph, testify. Some spoke publicly, trying to make the world understand. Others carried their knowledge in silence. But all of them, in their various ways, bore witness. They saw. They remembered. They tried to ensure that what they had seen would not be forgotten or denied, and what they became, in those moments and in all the years that followed, were people who had looked into the abyss, who had seen the absolute worst of human capability, who carried that knowledge forward into lives that could never be entirely free from the weight of what they knew. The liberation of the concentration camps revealed to the world what the Nazi regime had done, but it revealed something else as well. It showed what human beings are capable of bearing witness to, documenting, and trying to prevent from ever happening again. The soldiers who entered those camps in April 1945 did not ask for that responsibility. They did not volunteer to become witnesses to genocide. But when circumstance placed them in that role, they fulfilled it. Imperfectly, incompletely, but faithfully. They took the photographs. They wrote the reports. They testified at trials. They brought German civilians to see the evidence. They cared for survivors. They documented crimes. And in doing so, they created a record that serves, even now, 80 years later, as evidence of both the depths to which humanity can sink and the determination with which decent people can respond to atrocity. What happened when Allied troops discovered the concentration camps is still happening, still being processed, understood, taught, remembered, still challenging each new generation to confront what was done and what was witnessed and what responsibilities we inherit from that terrible spring of 1945. The answer to the question is not simple or singular. It unfolds across time and encompasses individual trauma and collective memory and legal precedent and moral obligation. It includes the moment Private Hoyt smelled death on the wind approaching Ohrdruf. The moment Eisenhower forced himself to examine every part of that camp despite his revulsion. The moment Murrow tried to find words for his radio audience. The moment survivors realized they had lived when millions had died. The moment American civilians saw photographs in magazines and understood, however, incompletely, what had been discovered. All of these moments together constitute what happened, and all of them together fail to fully answer the question, because what happened exceeds our capacity to comprehend or articulate it completely. We can only document. Remember, try to honor both the dead and those who witnessed their deaths. Try to ensure that the knowledge of what humans can do to each other remains vivid enough to prevent it from happening again. That is what happened when Allied troops discovered the concentration camps. That is what continues to happen as we remember, study, teach, and grapple with the evidence they documented. That is what must keep happening for as long as humans study history and try to learn from it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.